Welcome to the 240M Module 5 lecture. We're going to talk about managing printers and remote desktop services. Our objectives for this lecture are managing printer permissions, managing printers and print servers, sharing printers on a Windows network, remote desktop administration mode, remote desktop services application mode, and additional remote desktop modes. So printing, we've got printing roles. When you install the print and document role service, it allows you granular print management control. The role services include printer server, the distributed scan server, internet printing, and Lpd services. The print server allows administrators to set up and manage printer shares. It is not required to share a printer, but it does allow for better management. So you could just go to your printers folder and just add the printer there. But if you go to the print server management role, by adding that, it allows you to do some additional things more easily. The distributed scan server role allows administrators to redirect network scans to destinations on the server. This was traditionally controlled by the printer or scanner itself, but can now be managed through Server 2012. Internet printing allows administrators to open up network printers to non-domain users, both inside the office and remotely. This works well in hotels and mail service stores like Kinko's and UPS. So if you would like to allow people to print to your printers that are already secured to your domain, you can open this up through internet printing, and they can go to a web page, and you can allow them to have a username and password so they can access your printer and print there. Lpd services allow the administrator to share Unix-based printers on a Windows network. So if you have a Unix-based printer, then you can now connect that to a Windows server and allow people shared access to that particular printer. By default, everyone with access to the network can print to a printer. This includes the guest account if you choose to enable the guest account. However, this may not be what you want. You may not want everyone to have access to be able to print. Printer permissions set the maximum allowed access level for a printer. There are two different types of permissions that are applied whenever someone tries to print. You have standard and special permissions. Read permission allows a user to view permissions assigned to the printer. Change permissions allows a user to change permissions assigned to the printer. And take ownership allows you to take ownership of the printer, its print job, or both. So by default, you're going to be able to do read, which allows a user to view permissions. Print is a user can connect and print to a printer and manage their own print jobs. Manage printers, user has complete control over the printer and can also set permissions. Manage documents, users can manage individual print jobs. So of the three, manage printers is going to have the most amount of access. So let's take a look at the default printer permissions when you first add a printer on a server that's going to be connected to the domain. You have creator owner automatically controls the documents themselves, so you can delete a print job that you've created, but not necessarily everyone else. Everyone has the right to print. Administrators can print and also manage other people's documents and manage the printers themselves. Power users, print operators, and server operators also have these same roles. These are default roles that are created in a Windows domain. So how do you manage printer permissions? How to assign standard permissions, special permissions, and ownership? I will have to show you that in a demo. Managing print server properties. Print server properties control the global settings for all printers configured on a workstation or server. Print server properties can be accessed by opening Print Management and choosing the File menu, then Properties. You can configure settings for forms, ports, drivers, and advanced print server settings by going to these properties. The properties of each printer exposes a variety of configuration options depending on the printer driver. Some examples of what can be configured are the name of the printer, the port it uses, the printer driver, and the default paper size. Additional printer options such as duplexing, envelope printing, those kinds of things happen based on what the driver can do. If the driver cannot do two-sided printing because the printer can't do it, then you won't see that option. Sharing printers. Like folders, printers can also be shared on the network. The same type of share level permissions apply to printers as they do to file shares. So let's go ahead and take a look at printers. We're first going to go to our control panel, and we'll change to the large icon view. And then we're going to click on Devices and Printers. From here, we can see that we already have one printer set up. Let's just go ahead and create a new one. So let's click on Add Devices and Printers. Now it's going to search for various different drivers. It's going to see if anything's been connected to this server. And when it eventually realizes that nothing new is connected, it's going to let you continue on to the next stage. While we're waiting for that, let's just go ahead and choose the printer that's already here. We'll right click and you'll see the old way of accessing the properties was just to right click and go to properties, but you no longer see what you're expecting when you do that. But if you right click and choose printer properties, then you see the familiar screen that allows you to go and change different things such as sharing. So here we've shared our printer. We'll also say to render print jobs on the client computers to free up processor space on the server. And then if we choose list in directory, then it will also show up in Active Directory when we go searching for it. Ports. We can see that we chose an IP address. In your lab, when you go to choose ports, create ports, you just are going to create an IP address, but you won't actually be able to reach it. But that's okay. This is just for testing. You can also assign printers to ports that are attached on your computer, such as LPT printing ports, which we used to use basically in the 1990s, or COM ports, which we used in the 80s and 90s. And then you can also print directly to a file if you want. Under Advanced, this allows you to change the driver. From here, we can choose the drop-down, choose Other Installed Drivers, or we can click on New Driver, and we can add it here. We can say whether or not it's always available. We can choose some other options as well. Color management. If the printer is capable of color, you'll see this option, and from here you can make changes. Security. Here's where the rights are that we talked about earlier. So if we double click on everyone, then we'll be able to see that the Manage Printer print option is the only one that's there, but we can choose to add additional rights if we'd like to. If we click on Advanced, we can go into Special Permissions, and we can choose everyone or whoever we would like. Click Add, and then we'll be able to go in and make changes to some of those as well. We can also go into Auditing and add auditing for people who print so we know who's printing. And we can check the effective access of a user's rights here by selecting the user, put the username, and then we can see what rights they'll have to be able to print. All right, so let's go back to our device. And it says that no device is found. So it says you're not connected to online help because our VMs are not connected. So we're going to have to add our device a different way. So you're going to get that message if you choose that. So instead, we're going to go back to our printers, and we're just going to add a printer instead. It says that our printer wasn't listed. Let's just go ahead and click Next. We can add a printer using TCP/IP, which is what we're going to want to do. We can have it auto-detect, which we don't want to do. I'm going to say TCP/IP. So we're going to type in the IP address that says in your lab. We're not going to want to query the printer because it doesn't exist, but if it did, you could go ahead and do that. Now, even though we're not querying the printer, it's still going to try to detect the TCP/IP port itself. Eventually, this will time out. This is a normal thing, and it should only take about 20 seconds or so for it to time out. Okay, went ahead and timed out, and from here we can choose the type of card that we want to assign. Let's go ahead and choose the generic network card. And from here we can choose a printer we'll choose an HP printer that's easy to get to. It already has it loaded, but if we want, we can go to Have Disk and load it up that way, or go to Windows Update. We'll call it whatever we want. In this case, we'll call it test. And do we want to share it? Sure, we'll share it. And then do we want to set the default printer? No. Do we want to print a test page? No. And click finish. So now we see where it says test, we see the little sharing. So if we want to actually browse to that particular printer from the network, you can definitely do a //DC01, and we should see that printer, and there it is, test 02. So from any workstation, you'll be able to do that as well. Remote access and administration. So remote access it used to be called Terminal Services, and then in Windows 2008 R2 they changed it to Remote Desktop Services. Well, there's two different types of remote desktop services. The first one is the administration mode. So remote desktop services, RDP, can run in two modes: remote desktop administration mode and application server mode. Both modes of RDP can be accessed using the remote desktop protocol client. Both modes of RDP rely upon the terminal services service, now called remote desktop services, to function, and that service is installed and configured to run on all Windows servers by default. To enable remote desktop administration mode, open the System Utility and Control Panel and choose the Remote tab. Under the Remote Desktop section, choose Allow Connections from Computers Running Any Version. So that's a pretty easy thing to do. We're just going to go ahead and go back to, there we go, our computer. Right click, go to Properties, click on Remote Settings, and from here we want to allow the remote assistance, we want to allow remote connections, and we want to allow, if we do this particular box, then it'll just be from computers that are Windows Vista or newer. If we uncheck the box, then it will be from any version. Remote desktop administration mode has some limitations. Only 2 administrators can use this at any one time. So if you want more than 2, then you'll have to go with the next version of remote desktop services, which we'll talk about. By default, RDP uses port 3389, so if any firewall is employed, an exception must be made on that port. So when you enable remote desktop services, it automatically opens up that port. But if you want to use any other port, then you'll have to open that up on the firewall. Users are granted access to connect to terminal services, now called Remote Desktop Services mode, by membership in the Remote Desktop Users group. So in order to get onto a computer to log into it, you have to be part of the Remote Desktop Users group. And I showed you in the last module how to add users to a group. So when you're logged in to Remote Desktop Services, you can do one of 2 things to get out of them. You can either disconnect or you can log off. So when you close the RDP client with the red X at the top, in the top corner, you are disconnecting from the server you are managing. This leaves the session open and running and disconnects the client from it. Log off, however, ends the user session and opens up a slot for another administrator to log on. So what this means is we're in Remote Desktop Services mode to my host right now. So you see this X at the top. So if I choose to click that X, then the server will still think I'm logged into it. I'm just disconnected from it. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you log off of the Remote Desktop Services mode. Choose the log off option. Otherwise, you will only be able to have those 2 sessions going, and you'll have to disconnect one of them manually in order to free it up again. Enabling Remote Desktop Administration mode, I showed you how to do that. You enable RDAM using the system icon on the control panel, and then you enable the users to use it. The other type of remote desktop services is the server mode. Application server mode. Application server mode is differentiated from remote desktop administration mode by intended utilization. ASM mode is intended for end user use and not for administration purposes. So the last one we talked about was just for administrators to log into the server. This one is for users to log in and to access various different applications. ASM mode requires a separate end user license called a client access license. So for everybody who logs in, you have to have a special CAL. ASM is intended to centrally deliver end user applications rapidly. ASM has 3 key elements: the client, the ASM server, running the session host, and the license running the client access licenses. There are other roles that can go along with this, such as the connection broker, which can offer load balancing across multiple remote desktop servers. So if you would like to create a server farm where you have multiple remote desktop servers, all load balancing across various different servers, then you choose the connection broker service to do that. Gateway allows a server to be placed in the DMZ and linked back to an RDP server for additional security. So if you want people from the outside not to access your server on the inside of the network directly, you can have them access a server in the DMZ, and then the DMZ then proxies the connection back to the server on the inside. Virtualization Host is another option that's new. It allows a new virtual server session for every remote desktop client. So anybody who logs in, it actually creates a brand new virtual server, sort of like the virtual servers that you created with VirtualBox. So every user would get a new server when they log in. And then there's web access, allows access to applications over a web browser. So instead of using the remote desktop protocol client, you can just go into Internet Explorer or some other web browser, and from there you click on the icons that you want, and it opens up an individual RDP client for every different application. So let's go ahead and show what that looks like. So if we go into Control Panel, and then we click on Server Manager, or just click on Server Manager in this left corner. Then from there, we can go ahead and we can see that the remote desktop services is something that's not there by default, but we can add it. So it is a role just like any other role. So we add the role, click Next, and even though we're adding remote desktop services, we're not going to choose the remote desktop services installation. This is for virtual desktops only. We're going to choose the more traditional one. So click Next, choose Remote Desktop Services, Next, and then features if we want any. We're not going to choose at this time. And now here's all those different role services that go with the server role we talked about earlier. There's the connection broker, gateway, licensing, session host, virtualization host, and web access. So let's just go ahead and we'll choose them all. Now whenever we choose this, if it requires additional role services, it will just go ahead and prompt you to add those, which you'll go ahead and choose. And at this time, we're not going to be able to add the desktop virtualization without going back and adding it in the previous location. So we'll go ahead and choose all of them but that one. We'll go ahead and install. This will actually take a little bit longer to do, but I'll pause the video so you don't have to wait through it. And in some cases, it needs to reboot after the installation. Okay, the installation is done, and it's saying that a restart is pending in order to get back into that. So we'll just go ahead and click Close. And then after it restarts, we'll be able to set up and configure remote desktop application server mode. So we're not going to be doing that in this class. I just wanted to show you how to install it. And then from there, you can also install the administration mode as we did when we went to the properties of the computer. So in conclusion, we went over managing printers and printer services, managing printer permissions, sharing printers on a Windows network, remote desktop administration mode, services application mode, and additional remote desktop modes.